it's 5:30, so shall we start? People can just come in as they do, but I think we have a few announcements to make, I think, or do we not, Kate?
Do we? We can make announcements.
Well,
yeah. While people are coming in, let's make a couple of announcements. So we posted this on Facebook today, but we have set up a website where we can keep you updated on upcoming events, speakers that we have planned, and also hopefully keep an archive of the talks that we've had in the past. Exactly. Oh, there you go. It's brand new today, so it's quite basic at the moment, but we're going to put whistles and bells and make it prettier as we go through, but it's brand new today. So bookmark that for your future activities. We've also set up a Twitter account, but then we managed to get it blocked almost immediately. So that will be working soon.
I think we are back online. Good. Yes, we're not blocked anymore.
Okay, so that should be working as well. You can access that through the website. We'll post the @ address in the chat at the end of the meeting. That's it, isn't it, I think?
Yep, it is. Right, so today's agenda is we have a talk by fabulous Gemma Williams from the University of Brighton, and then after Gemma's talk we have discussion. After that we will introduce a couple of speakers for the next couple of months. We are so very excited. Okay, so shall we start? Gemma, when you're ready and you mute. Okay, so all yours. Hold on, should I have introduced Gemma properly?
That's pretty proper. Okay, so can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Amazing. Okay. Brilliant. So hello. And thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I was really excited when I heard about this group. I think it's a really brilliant idea to make the most of this sort of remote networking that's started in the last year, to keep in touch with each other and hear what everyone's up to and discuss ideas. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here. I've also just taken a beta blocker because I'm really nervous, but you're all lovely, so I'm sure it's fine. So I've recently finished my PhD at the University of Brighton with Tim Wharton, who's there as my supervisor. And I had my Viva in January, which was also online and a bit strange. And Deirdre Wilson was one of my examiners. So today I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, I think. I'll give a kind of little summary of what my research was about, introduce some theoretical concepts that ended up being quite central to it, and finish with some outstanding questions. And one of them was something that Deirdre Wilson asked me at the end of my Viva, which I think is hopefully interesting to think about together. So it's quite loose. It's some ideas I've been working with, but I'm not quite there yet with how they all intersect. So I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts. So the aims of my PhD were to investigate the strength of this primary hypothesis, which is that relevance theory, and specifically the relevance theoretic notion of mutual manifestness, can help to make sense of what's happening on a cognitive level during the breakdowns in mutual understanding between autistic and non-autistic individuals, which is sometimes referred to as the double empathy problem. So to kind of just spell out a few of those kind of terms there. So autism is one of the central diagnostic and anecdotal features of autism is a difficulty with social communication. So autism medically is classified as a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it hangs on a set of observed and reported behavioural characteristics. There's no biological test for autism currently. So traditionally, the difficulties observed in social communication are regarded as autistic impairments, and they've been related to proposed cognitive and social deficits that create the pragmatic impairments in interaction. And one of the main reasons given for this is a poor theory of mind abilities. So a reduced ability to impute mental states to others, which is obviously fundamental to inferential communication. Autism is now also commonly conceptualized as a form of neurodivergence, i.e. A specific neurological state or a unique disposition, and something that's different but not less. So there's a whole kind of, it could be a very long discussion about how to define autism, but for now, that's probably enough. So from the perspective of seeing autism as a type of neurodivergence, the double empathy problem was proposed. And this suggests that cross-dispositional communication is a term I'll use a lot in the next 20 minutes. So interactions between speakers of two different neurotypes, in this case between autistic people and non-autistic people, is troubled by a disjuncture and reciprocity between two differently disposed social actors who crucially hold different norms and expectations of each other. So in this context, misunderstanding or lack of understanding isn't necessarily a consequence of autistic impairment, but a mutual failure in reaching consensus. So returning quickly to the aims, this idea of holding different norms and expectations of each other got me thinking about the role that relevance and expectations of relevance might have to play in these cross-dispositional interactions. So there was a theoretical component and an empirical component to my research. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the findings from the empirical part, but there is a paper that we currently have under review with Tim and Caroline Jago as co-authors. So if you're interested, keep your eyes out for that. But I think a little bit of background about the data analysis would be useful for contextualizing the theory. For the empirical part, I recorded 20 naturalistic conversations lasting around 10 minutes each, featuring 8 core autistic participants who each were engaged in 3 conversations in different conversation conditions, like this. So there was the core autistic participant, and in the first instance, they spoke to a familiar chosen partner that they brought along with them. The second conversation was with an autistic stranger, so one of the other core participants, and the third conversation was with a non-autistic stranger. And these conversations were unstructured, and they were just prompted to and invited to talk about experiences of loneliness in the Brighton and Hove area where we're based. And so originally I'd expected to follow a similar process to one that was used by Caroline Jago in her work looking at delusional talk, interactions involving delusional talk. Now, this wasn't because there was any assumed association between autism and schizophrenia, nothing to do with that at all. It was simply that it was a really useful and novel method of investigating the role that assumptions of mutual manifestness had in breakdowns in communication. And in this case, it was a really great example of where assumptions didn't match when some of the speakers were engaged in delusional episodes. However, it became evident very quickly that there were very few instances of communication breakdown in the whole 240 minutes of the transcribed conversations, which maybe foolishly I hadn't predicted. I'd expected some some breakdowns. So for if anything, the conversations were characterized by sustained mutual understanding. So I revised the plan to focus instead on the qualitative differences in the patterns of conversation that had become apparent in the first readings. And I went through a kind of iterative process of coding the conversations and found that the codes clustered into 4 kind of groupings that I called motifs. So the first motif was flow, and it included characteristics such as fast pace exchanges with short turns, gaps, lapses, and stiltedness. So within this motif, there were instances of where flow was present and flow wasn't present. Overlapping turns, long turns, monologues, and for some of the longer turns were over 1.5 minutes, and in some cases they were due to a speaker dominating or holding the floor, and in other instances it seemed to be more that the listener was allowing the speaker to go on, particularly where the speaker's speech was somewhat laboured, and they seemed perhaps appeared hooties. Interruptions, minimally or tangentially relevant responses. I've said I'll return to special interest, but I don't think I will. I think I cut that out, so you can ignore that. The second motif was called tuning in. So that included characteristics of conversational form and non-propositional content that indicates that interlocutors are on the same wavelength. So some of the features included checking questions, crosstalk, evidence of rapport and effect, examples of mirroring and echoing, and that might be on a kind of word-by-word basis, or in terms of offering parallel anecdotes, evidence of accommodation and converging, and the presence of jokes and humour. And then the third and fourth motifs were, the third was called Running Along the Edges of Meaning. So this borrows its title from a really beautiful article involving some linguistic ethnographic analysis of an interaction between an autistic boy and his mother by Staponi and Fasulo. And it involved things like really left field topic development, abrupt topic changes, something that's been referred to as a low demand for coherence, which was identified in another study looking at autistic interactions in groups of autistic people. I don't know if you can hear the children screaming. They're not my children. I live next to a nursery. And non-words and onomatopoeia. And then turned out to be a very small motif involving mutual manifestness, so instances where it appeared to be expected but seemed to be missing, or moments where it was really evident that it was there because things didn't need to be said. So what was most interesting for me was that all 5 of the matched dispositional conversations, so those that were between 2 autistic speakers, seemed to be characterized by a significant increase in flow, rapport, and intersubjective attunement. So we'll touch back a little bit on the motifs and the data shortly, but for now I want to focus on these central qualities and concepts that emerged from the analysis, and that's what I'm interested in mapping out in relation to relevance and also to each other, and they are flow, interest, and effect as an element of rapport. So when I was coding for flow initially, I was thinking of flow in terms of conversational flow, and the definition I used was based on one by Kudenberg, Postmez, and Gordigan, practice saying that, but it doesn't sound right, who argue that it's a wholly subjective experience of a conversation, experiencing as smooth, efficient, and mutually engaging. But of course, that you can't measure that from the outside. So objective characteristics of this have been understood to include high quality turn taking, short response latencies, and minimal interruptions, gaps, lapses, etc., and monologic turns. But flow is a really fascinating concept. I've become really fascinated by it, and it seemed to cross many different human activities. So, according to Csikszentmihalyi, flow is what might be thought of as a form of optimal experience, what he describes as optimal experience. In other words, a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at a great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. There are many types of behaviour that might lead us to states of flow, or what you might call being in the zone if you're a sports person. Could be reading an engrossing book, sitting up late, writing a Zoom presentation, having a really great bath. There's as many opportunities as there are for us to engage our attention are possible routes to flow. Because flow, like relevance, might be thought of as another sweet spot. But here, the sweet spot is between the challenge of a presently engaging task and one that matches a person's skills and abilities to perform it. So it's not too challenging, but it's not too easy. So according to Csikszentmihalyi, attention is focused into a concentrated stream. And when this occurs, as there are limited attentional resources available for other matters, self-consciousness disappears. And you can often experience time dilation, where time might go really quickly or really slowly, and it loses its normal kind of rhythm. And action and awareness merge into one synchronous, almost automatic act. So a state of flow is contingent on intent.
Have we lost Gemma there?
Gemma, your sound is off.
Gemma, your sound is off. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can now.
Yep.
For some reason the camera and the microphone stopped working, but just have a close-up of my head. Sorry about that. Was there much that was missed, do you think?
About a minute or two.
Oh, okay.
Just maybe 1 point on the one bullet point on the slide.
Okay. Did you hear a definition of flow?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and go from there. Modern world. So that's a perfect example of flow being interrupted. I was here in what I thought was a great sense of flow, just in the moment, and had no sense that it had all broken down. So had we got to this point with the different examples of what can induce a flow state?
Yes, I think the next slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
yeah.
Okay, great. So so flow is described as a sweet spot between effort and your ability to achieve a task. And I think I just about got to the point where I was saying that communication to me seems like a good candidate for inducing flow, because and probably many of us have experienced talking with friends or talking with colleagues about something we're really engaged in and time just sweeps by. So Rosa Nill, who's a pedagogical theorist and teacher of writing, also argues that flow is an essential characteristic of good writing, and it's the natural forward movement that carries the reader through the text. She teaches good writing skills by introducing learners to relevance theory, arguing that each sentence and each paragraph creates an expectation about relevant information to come in the subsequent sentence or paragraph. And crucially, she argues that a definition of relevance also helps one to understand why flow matters. A high degree of flow minimizes processing effort, whereas a low degree of flow increases processing effort. Okay, so that's flow. Monotropism and interest. So flow closely relates to attention, as we've just looked at. And this was really relevant for me in my research, because it's long been recognised that attention allocation in autistic people differs to that of non-autistic people. And there have been a number of theories of autism that have been based on that or utilised that idea. So in this case, though, I was most interested in the concept of monotropism, which is an interest-based account of autism originally proposed by 3 autistic scholars in what they describe as a dynamic ecological model of minds. A monotropic account begins from the position that the mind is essentially an interest system and that attention is a limited resource. This fits really well, I think, with the way that cognition is viewed from a relevance theoretic perspective. And interests are understood to be what we care about and what we spontaneously give our attention to. So the degree and breadth of attention allocation in humans is understood to be normally distributed and genetically determined, with some people possessing greater tendency toward multiply focused attention that they call polytropism, and others toward more narrowly focused attention called monotropism. So those diagnosed or identifying as autistic tend to find themselves at the far end of this distribution with an intensely focused but narrow attention tunnel. So where non-autistic typical minds will comfortably entertain multiple simultaneous interests that are each moderately aroused, the autistic mind tends to maintain much fewer simultaneous interests, with each one highly aroused and intensely focused upon. I'm not sure if that torches a good image or not, but I put it there. So atypical monotropic strategies for the allocation of attention are put forward as a central cause for a lot of autistic social and behavioural characteristics. And one idea, is that social and communicative difficulties might come about as a consequence of a difficulty in processing information from a variety of simultaneous channels, audio, visual, drawing on encyclopedic knowledge, social situations, and having to do that at speed, particularly the more so when the environment is increasingly chaotic or complex with sensory information. So just returning briefly to my data, something interesting that came out of the analysis was that some of the autistic participants appeared to experience more optimal communicative competence when they were engaged in the matched dispositional conversation, so with another autistic person. So for example, their turns became more coherent and directly relevant to preceding turns, and fluency improved, stumbles and restarts were reduced, that kind of thing. And this potentially lends support to a monotropic account of communicative difficulties in autism, because where flow was also increased in these conversations at the same time, it might be that with less effort being required as a result of the increased flow to processing an incoming utterance, that there are more cognitive resources available to be allocated to the productive side of and mechanical sides of language. There's a lot more that could be said about monotropism and interest, but I think for now that's probably enough. So one of the other key or core concepts that came out of the coding was rapport and effect. In the conversations I looked at, flow and rapport tended to be quite highly correlated and often occur simultaneously, which I suppose you might intuitively expect as well. So rapport is another one of these terms that's a bit fluffy and hard to define, again, because it's experienced subjectively and intersubjectively, and it's hard to measure accurately from the outside. However, a definition from Tickle-Degnan and Rosenthal is often used, and that involves mutual attentiveness, affective positivity, and behavioural coordination, i.e. being in sync. However, they're not particularly reliable, and these could probably all be observed from the outside in cases of pseudo rapport, for example, where maybe a teacher really wants the best for their student, but doesn't particularly like them and doesn't particularly have a genuine rapport with them. So in order to try and improve the description or the definition, Tickle-Degnan reworked it to frame rapport as a kind of optimal experience, drawing on Csikszentmihalyi's definition of flow and optimal experience. She argued that a similar kind of optimal balance is also pertinent to the rapport ecosystem, and that in these optimal experiences, speakers tend to feel calm and acting in calm and yet attentive ways. But nevertheless, affect is still, positive neutral affect is an important constituent element of rapport. And some relevance theorists, including Tim Morton and colleagues, and Segarach and colleagues, argue that something of the affective domain is frequently communicated alongside the propositional content of an utterance, for example, in expressives, through what have been termed affective effects. And where human cognition is understood to be geared toward the maximization of relevance, affective effects constrain the parameters of what might be perceived as salient, and essentially work to reduce the effort required to achieve optimal relevance. So an example, I think Tim's using a paper of his, in the case of fear, for example, emotion might trigger a hypervigilant state where the experiencer attributes more salience to finer grain sensory perceptual inputs, like minor creaks on the floorboards in the next room. And in terms of communication, if the hushed tones and widened eyes of the communicator experiencing fear are registered by an addressee, whether they've been ostensively exaggerated or just instinctual and unintended, the addressee may perceive fear, infer some kind of threat, become fearful themselves, and adopt their own hypervigilant state. So this, in some ways, it's related to the idea of emotional contagion. So, just as affective effects may work to constrain the context of an utterance, or to increase the salience of and the effort required to reach certain interpretations, it might also be, I think, that rapport amplifies certain presently held assumptions, which in turn reduces cognitive effort required to arrive at the intended meaning. So this is where it gets a bit more vague in questions. So shared experiences and in-jokes can lead to larger common ground and potentially to a greater mutual cognitive environment. It may be the higher levels of positive effect that we hold for an interlocutor, the more inclined we are to be helpful speakers in our interactions, the further we're willing to go with that. And Segerat, Cayley and Batty have argued that in communicative interaction aimed at managing rapport, such as the phatic use of language, effective mutuality is caused by assumptions about the positive social disposition of the participants toward each other. So according to this account then, part of what's included in effective mutuality, or rapport by another name, is the shared assumptions of positive effect. And these assumptions might be informed initially by the affective effects transmitted by the kind of emotional communication that Wharton and colleagues have described in different ways, but they potentially become part of the mutual cognitive environment. And this is clearly beneficial in terms of a relevance theoretic account of communication, because where the mutual cognitive environment also includes assumptions about mutual effect and mutual trust as shaped by the positive rapport, the need for epistemic vigilance is perhaps potentially minimized, and so reducing the degree of effort required to reach the intended meaning. Okay, so I'm near the end. So to recap before I finish, so flow is a state and quality arising from attention being focused on intensely on a specific task that presents an achievable challenge. Monotropic theory talks about attention as a limited resource, with interest being what we care about and spontaneously give our attention to, either momentarily or over an extended period of time. Affect is essentially a component of rapport, which Tickle Degnan has linked to optimal experience of flow, and it potentially works to constrain the context of an utterance and reduce cognitive efforts. And relevance is, of course, a dynamic quality related to least cognitive efforts for greatest cognitive effects. So things in a heightened attention tunnel potentially have greater salience, so they seem likely to influence judgments of relevance positively or negatively. And relevance and interest seem intuitively related, but the more I think about it, the more I've looked at this slide, it becomes vaguer and vaguer. But I feel like they're kind of working together and related in some way that might be interesting. So near the end of the Viva, Deirdre Wilson posed this question to me around what to kind of get to the nitty gritty of what's the difference between interest and relevance, and why I use the term interest, which isn't technically defined, certainly not to the same degree when relevance exists as a term. And I'm also interested in what's the relationship between interest, relevance, and flow. So thank you very much. As well as the empirical paper, there's also a theoretical paper that's also under review. So if you're interested, I'll be sharing those on my blog and on Twitter. And I haven't made a reference slide, but if you would like the references, I can send them to you. Just send me an email. Thank you so much.
Okay. Right. Thanks, Gemma. It was so very, very interesting. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Maybe we can all think about 10 seconds before firing away. Right, 10 seconds is up. Any questions or comments? And I don't think I can see, you can raise hands from the reaction button or just talk over.
Tim had his hand up.
Did I?
Briefly, or maybe you were clapping.
No, it was a clap.
Oh.
Okay. Can I just comment then rather than questions? I have a lot of questions, but while people are still putting together questions in their mind, what I thought was what you were discussing here reminded me of communication breakdown or issues with communication between learners and so-called native speaker, whatever that means nowadays. So what I was thinking, your work is very much framed within this autistic people with autism, but I just thought there's a lot of universal characteristics I could find in your talk. And hold on, Erica is there. I think that's my PhD student who's working on the learners and problem they have, pragmatic awareness and so on. But I definitely saw how this rapport, I can never pronounce this word properly, rapport could work, influence the way we communicate as well, and flow. The motifs you're listing also was very much characteristics we find in learners' data as well. So yeah, I'd like to very much read your PhD thesis. It is so very interesting, and it's great to see the link between relevant theoretic work and works from other discipline as well.
Thank you. I mentioned a paper by Zedgerak and colleagues, and where they addressed the issue of rapport, and actually they spoke about it in the context of language learning. So that might, there is a link. There's some kind of link going on.
Yeah, I see Tim's raising your hand.
Yeah, I did raise my hand that time. Sorry, I'm not very good with the button. I'll lower my hand now. Thank you, Gemma. It was really, really, really interesting. It just seems like yesterday that you began your PhD, and then a few weeks ago we had you. I mean, it was literally a few weeks ago that Gemma passed her Viva with no corrections, I might add, which is pretty impressive. What I wanted to just say was just something relating to that last issue that you raised, the last couple of slides, about the intersection between interest, relevance, flow, attention, and then affect being off to the side. And because Deirdre raised it at the Viva, I've been thinking a lot about interest. And as some of you know, I've been doing a lot of work with some affective scientists. And hopefully if I get the chance to do a presentation at this new reading group or presentation thing, I'll talk about that. But one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of affective scientists say that interest is an emotion. And that's one answer to Deirdre's question that I think she might be interested in. Why use interest when you could be using the term relevance? Well, one very good reason is that interest is an emotion, and relevance, at least as it's currently construed, doesn't appear to be an emotion. So, I mean, that's not, there's nothing conclusive in that comment. It's not something I've thought about particularly, other than, I mean, I had a conversation with one of these people that I've been working with from Geneva, and he's done a lot of work on the emotion that we call interest. And I was sort of frankly surprised when I first heard it. But the more I think about it, the more I sort of like it, because it's, it's a feeling of something, and it does, I mean, you talked about fear, but interest is just the same, isn't it? It makes you focus on particular things. So that's all. It's a comment that's just...
That's interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting.
So if I can add to what Tim was just saying about interest being emotion, this might or might not be relevant, but when we were doing some eye tracking experiment of avid manga readers and where their eyes will land when they are reading manga pages. What we found was their eyes are very much dictated by their interest. So if someone is interested in, say, if someone is, say, studying, what is the word? Spaceships, the study of spaceship and these things, astrophysics, okay, whatever. Okay, so they tend to fixate on that type of drawings on the page. If someone's interested in, say, martial arts, their eyes will be drawn to the fighting page even when there's a spaceship next to it. So again, I can see how this emotionally driven interest or interest as emotion could lead our attention to a certain aspect of communicative stimuli. Maybe that might or might not be relevant. Anyway, we see Stavros and Billy raising hands. Whoever can.
Stavros was first.
Okay.
Thank you. No, just my 2 cents, because this is really interesting. I mean, the whole like this. Well, first of all, thanks for organizing this. This is really awesome. Actually, I never managed to give you congratulations on this. This was a really nice talk. I mean, my understanding is that to a certain extent, relevance is sort of a property that lies with the stimulus itself, whereas the interest is something that guides behavior and is not something that's a given, sort to say, right? I mean, I wouldn't know how to put it in an eloquent way, but I think that the distinction there is that, you know, relevance is something that applies to ostensive stimuli, to whatever have you, like to cognitive processes and all that, whereas interest is a driving force for doing things, so to say. So there's no, to my mind, I don't see how you would be able to actually replace interest with some notion of relevance. At least in the technical sense of the term, obviously, right? I mean, if you're interested in something, it will be relevant for you, but in a more non-technical way. I think that to a certain extent, interest could be approached in terms of prospective cognitive effects or something like, you know, something that you know, you're bound to benefit a lot from, and that's why you get an interest in that. But again, I think that it's not just a matter of cognitive effects. I think to my mind, it's more of a matter of, you know, perceptual effects or affective effects, or you know, there are so many terms these days that I need to start reading on. But that's my 2 cents on this. I mean, this was really, really interesting, and thanks for the inspiration, actually.
And
also just intervene and say that there's also the cognitive principle of relevance. So there's not only the principle of relevance, the communicative principle, but also the cognitive one. And maybe the cognitive one looks more like something that could be related to interest.
Okay, thanks. And Billy?
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed it as well. And I'm just slightly worried that I might be ruining the flow by just asking you to repeat something you already said. Which is, I'm quite interested in immersion in, like, when you're reading a novel or watching a film. And I've just been talking to students about what makes you forget you're watching a film or reading a novel and just be in it. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And I'm not sure whether I missed you talking about the effects bit, because I'm kind of thinking, for me, what breaks the flow for me in a film is when nothing's happening. So you see a character and then you see them going about their day for 5 minutes. Then I zone out. But as long as something new keeps happening, so there are effects. And the other thing that breaks it is, like you said, the effort, if it gets too effortful. So I might just be asking you to repeat yourself, so I'm sorry if I am, but is that something you're talking about, immersion in that kind of sense as well?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think maybe the idea of the effects are probably to do with the, because I think one of the key features of flow is that there's fairly instant feedback. So probably if you're watching film, like the feedback is you're getting, like you say, updated information about the progress of the narrative or something, and when that slows down. But there's a really interesting paper, I can't remember the authors now, who looked at all the different kinds of terms that have been used, like narrative absorption and flow, and they kind of put them under the umbrella of presence related phenomena, and they did quite a really nice detailed analysis of people getting into video games, you know, and getting into that state. So if you're interested, I can find it and link it to you.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Just to say, I've thrown another reference for you. I've been reading a book by George Saunders, the writer, which just came out. It's called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. And it's like his writing class summarized, looking at Russian writers. And he's got lots of nice examples. One of his things he says is that stories should always be escalating. You don't want to meet somebody and then see nothing happen for a while. And you don't want digressions that haven't got anything to do with it. So I think that would fit in as well.
I think Adam has been raising his hand.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Becky. That was a great, sorry, Gemma. Oh, wrong person. A great presentation. Following on from, I think, Tim's comment and Stavros's comment regarding the issue of, you know, if interest is identical with relevance. I've been wondering, because, you know, when you revisit relevance, some of the concepts are kind of very abstract. So, for instance, relevance itself is like a property of stimuli. It's not quite the same thing as a claim about actual cognitive processes or what's actually being represented at any given moment necessarily, right? And I think that comes up, I think sometimes people misunderstand mutual manifestness in that sense as well. I mean, obviously it has to be cognitively plausible, but it's a kind of explanatory, it's like an explanatory concept. And I think the concept that seems to me to be more overlapping with interest are actually hopes or expectations of relevance. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a potential angle to explore. It's just a thought that occurred to me when listening to Tim and Stavros there.
I like the idea of hopes of relevance. It's the optimistic speaker.
Yeah. Thanks again. Your presentation was fantastic. Lots to really mull over there. Brilliant.
And Angelica?
Hi. Well, this issue about interest and relevance is actually something I have been working with on a paper, and I was thinking about the relationship between attention and relevance interest, because attention is limited and it's very difficult to analyze, you know, what kind of attention each person has. For example, remember a study on TDHD is just remember in English. Just a sec. Attention deficit disorder, sorry. Because usually people think that the ones who suffer from attention deficit disorder is because they cannot pay attention on anything. And actually, it's just because you pay attention to too many things. But what happens is eventually there is this phenomenon of hyperattention, you know, a little similar to what you talked about. But because attention is limited and what calls our attention, and then there's this division because is it because something is interesting emotionally or because it's relevant? And I'm dealing with headlines, and I just read a paper Kate wrote about headlines. So when we are scrolling through headlines and then one of them catches our attention, I mean, when you describe why that caught your attention, is it because it's so strange? It's because it's relevant for your life? And then I tend to think a little more, it's because attention, it really has more to do with emotion than relevance. But I don't know, maybe I would like to hear what Kate thinks about that, because she wrote that article on headlines. Much more a question, because I'm working with headlines, and one of my colleagues wants to classify as interesting, and I don't know, it doesn't sound good enough for me. It doesn't feel like the right word to classify it. Thanks.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of drawn to that kind of discussion that's just come out in terms of maybe interest being that feeling when you think that, when you kind of almost become aware of the relevance that you might be getting, and the expectation of it, as Adam was saying. This is where my paper's just come out, but I wrote it a long time ago. I'm just trying to remember what I said. Yeah, I mean, I very much argued in that we're pulled in to click on a clickbait headline and go through when the headline asks us gives us a little bit of information, but not enough to satisfy our appetite for it. So our attention is drawn when we think there's more relevance coming, but we haven't got it yet, I guess. But I don't want to distract from Gemma's presentation and the discussion of her work, so I can present my headline stuff another day.
I mean, it all seems, the question you answer, to me, it seems really, really relevant, and it's so fascinating hearing people's perspectives. But there does seem to be intuitively some kind of like, some not quite, or maybe emotional or component to interest, which is guiding you toward relevance. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. And
obviously, as other people have said, that's going to vary from person to person. So somebody scrolling through and seeing a headline about the Kardashians or whatever won't find that interesting, won't want to click through, and it might, and other people will. So there's going to be won't find that relevant to them, or won't expect it to be relevant. I don't know. Sorry. Should have revised my own paper before I came here.
Okay, do we have any more questions or comments?
Well, if I may, I was trying to raise my hand, but maybe not very effectively. So, well, thank you so much, Gemma. That was really fantastic, and I enjoyed your presentation very much. And my comment is still related to this interest relevance thing, because I was thinking that in terms of, because you are applying a specific model of interest, so I didn't quite understand why did we say that interest is not well defined, because you seem to be applying a specific model, and when you had this the torch image, right? So I think interest must be defined in this model, and I think it would be definitely interesting to explore how interest is understood in this specific model and how relevance is understood in this in relevance theory. Well, intuitively, I think that we can say about autistic people that they have very specific interests. So maybe it would be interesting to explore whether this translates into some, I don't know, specific strategies for searching for relevance, or specific strategies of finding positive cognitive effects. Okay, so that's just my comment.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, so all of that was really interesting. The last thing you said about it having a potential role, it reminded me of the bit that I cut out, talking about so-called special interests, because I think you sort of touched on that. Autistic people often have these very focused passions or interests that last for a long period of time. And in the conversations, the moments where two autistic people manage to kind of realized that they both had a similar interest. Like there was a beautiful example where two people have pet dogs and they both love their dogs, and they realized the other person loved their dogs as much as they love their dogs, and they just got so excited, and it, you know, the flow changed, the report, everything. So yeah, that feels like it's related.
The last thing that struck me, and this isn't really that closely related to relevance theory, but the where I've come across the idea of flow before, which might reveal what my life's been like recently, is in relation to kind of stress management, and this idea that you can kind of break the stress cycle and de-stress by doing something that gets you into a flow, and they use that word, and when you're in that flow, it kind of has a chemical reaction in your body in terms of dissipating the stress. And I wondered if that might relate to making the conversations feel easier when they enter that flow, less demands, just, I don't know, if less stressful situation, particularly for people who maybe are finding the communicative situation difficult. I don't know if that's worth looking into.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sounds really right.
Any other comments or thoughts?
I mean, if I may, I think that there is also, I mean, there is something to be said about distinguishing between relevance as a cognitive heuristic that guides cognition and communication in different forms and formats and whatnot. And also relevance as, for example, there are all these references to relevance on a slightly different notion, which is how, like the expected, how some upcoming turn or whatever in a conversation is expected to establish relevance. And I think that there is a slight difference there. Relevance is essentially capturing interest to a certain extent, like what you're expecting to hear. If I'm asking a question, then in order to be relevant, the interlocutor will need to respond to this. So maybe it's in this dimension where generally, yeah, the flow would help with relevance, because you keep establishing, you know, relevance all over the place because it just flows. So there is coherence, and that way this happens. I guess I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah, thanks, Zacharias. Yeah, and thanks for the comment as well. I didn't say thank you before. I was microphone shy. I can't remember, was it Nicole? One of the person who's a specialist in pedagogical theory who spoke about flow. I think it was similar kind of idea about using it. She only used it in terms of writing, but that kind of, like, you know, kind of trying to build the interest and the expectation of relevance that then develop flow in a text. But that it makes sense that it would transfer into spoken communication.
I think that, you know, generally they're talking, I mean, if I remember correctly, they refer to more specific expectations of relevance other than the expectation of optimal relevance that is communicated. So these more specific expectations of relevance have to do with the actual thing that you're waiting to hear, or maybe you want to hear, if you want to sort of, you know, expand this notion and include interest in that, I would imagine. But again, you know, just a thought. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for comments, and thanks again, Gemma, for really, really interesting talk. Okay, so before we let you go in the teacher mode, here is our upcoming event. So should I take over, or shall I just keep on? Right, so this is from our new website, relevanceresearchers.com. And we this week we talked, we had Gemma presented just now. Okay, and next month in March, we have Valandis excuse my pronunciation, Vazokas from Thessaloniki. Welcome. Kate, take over.
No, my Greek's no better than yours.
Okay, right. Valandis will be talking on syntactic constraint on relevance. It's going to be very interesting, a little bit different to this month's talk and last month's talk. Really looking forward to this. And also confirmed was Tim Wharton from Brighton will be giving us a talk titled TBC, mystery. It's a mystery. You have to wait till next month.
You have to keep to check the website.
Yeah, and you have to keep coming to the session as well, right? And here is our Twitter. It worked. It worked. The Relevance Researchers Network. I don't know why we have so many R's in pronunciation when Japanese is talking, but never mind. So here you go. This is it. Thank you again for coming today, and looking forward to seeing you again next month. Kate?
Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to see everyone. Have a nice evening, and thank you again, Gemma.
Thanks, Gemma. You're fabulous. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.